Content warning, racism and slavery. Action, excitement, horror, romance, thrills and chills, swords and sorcery, rockets and ray guns, a dizzying panoply of the strange and impossible from the darkest depths of the human imagination. What mad universe encompasses such tales as these? Join us as we bear witness to the sweeping sprawl of all the history that never was and all the futures that could yet be. It's adventure as you like it on What Mad Universe?
It's been raining in the mountains and the rivers on the rise, and we cannot hardly reach the other side. And the devil, he's in trouble, I can see it in his eyes. If you don't give him shelter, he'll have no place to hide. The devil, he's inside.
Not all stories of monsters and witchcraft and wandering heroes who stand against them take place in ancient history or imagined kingdoms. They say that in the young United States of America, deep in the heart of the old mountains, walks a man with a silver-stringed guitar, pure of heart, learning and a-singing the old songs as he goes. John's his name, no more than just a natural man, well, maybe taller than some. Up these heights and down these hollows he goes, and the things he's seen and tells, if you believe it, you might get some good thing out of it. He's faced the evil and the unnatural and lived to speak and sing about it. Listen and you might learn. Who fears the devil? Good morning, welcome to What Mad Universe. Today we're looking at a series of stories by the author Manly Wade Wellman. About a character referred to simply in the stories as John, but known elsewhere for publishing purposes as Silver John or John the Balladeer.
Or sometimes Hillbilly John.
Which was the name of the movie that they eventually made of him.
We'll get to that later.
We will, yeah. He wrote these stories late 50s, early 60s, although they're kind of timeless. They don't have a... They're sort of set deliberately in a never existing time.
Mentions some modern things like Coca-Cola and the Korean War is mentioned once.
And they had truck. Yeah. Did they specifically mention the Korean War?
Yeah, not that he was in it.
Right.
Because he was in a war of some sort, but it does mention another character was in the Korean War.
Right. I think the implication you're supposed to take is that he's in the Korean War, but he very specifically doesn't mention which war he was in.
Yeah, so but another character does mention the Korean War specifically.
Right. Yeah, it was meant to be contemporaneous at the time.
Yeah.
But it's set in, and I mean, the whole point of setting it in sort of the backwoods of Appalachia is that it's kind of seen as an anachronistic time, a time cut off from the march of history and the march of modernity. I like to compare them to if the Conan the Barbarian stories were set in modern day Appalachians, and instead of killing monsters, Conan sang music at them and thereby defeated them. But it's got that it does have that wandering hero pulp feel, but it's based on, to a certain degree, the folklore of the of that area. He does weave in some sci-fi elements as well, which is kind of interesting. And
also some horror elements.
Right.
He was obviously influenced by Lovecraft in some ways.
Right.
Apparently one of the later books, which we weren't able to get a hold of, actually directly mentions Miskatonic University and the Necronomicon.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because he wrote those... there was a big gap. He wrote the short stories, then there was a gap, and then I guess he was sort of rediscovered, and then he started writing Silver John novels.
Yeah, in the 70s.
In the late 70s, early 80s, yeah. The last one's like 85 or 86, I think, so it's quite recent.
We weren't able to find most of the novels. We were able... because they're out of print.
Right.
We might track them down and do a future episode on this because I really like these stories, by the way.
Yeah, Phil really enjoyed them. But they're really cool. Yeah, it's it's as you know, that's kind of a colorful region. If you don't know, the Appalachians are a mountain range stretching parallel to the east coast of the U.S. They go as far north as Canada. When most people talk about the Appalachians, what they mean is the southern part of the range, encompassing the Great Smoky Mountains and the Blue Ridge, which are name-checked in the story. That passes through Virginia, West Virginia, Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. So that's kind of the area we refer to when we talk about people are being hillbillies. They came from that area. It was
Sons of the Soil.
Sons of the Soil, yeah. I'm sorry. You're right. They like to be referred to that way. Settled by Scotch and Irish immigrants in the early 1700s. They brought many of their customs with them. So the mountains were remote and cut off from much of the rest of the country, and the clan loyalties of the old country developed into tribal loyalties, suspicion of outsiders, and fierce self-reliance. So as I say, the supposedly more civilized people of the lowlands called them hillbillies. Up till the mid-20th century, it was seen as very much a sort of remote area, cut off in time. There's a lot of cliches about that area, about that whole period. And sometime in the 30s, there was actually a bit of a swell of people coming down into the cities to look for work. And that's kind of where we got a lot of media like Little Abner and stories about suddenly there was a sort of an interest in hillbillies and what was going on in the South. That whole pop cultural phenomenon's kind of cemented itself. I believe actually around World War II era, that's where it sort of exploded. And there's also the Ozarks, although those aren't the setting for the stories, but they're also known as kind of a backwoods mountain region. That's a little further west out in the Tennessee area. So they're famous for their superstitions. There's a lot of famous superstitions about the people of the Appalachians. Some of which probably descend, if you go far enough back, to like old Irish traditions and things like you don't inhale when you pass a graveyard, which is something we did when I was kids, but apparently that originates in Appalachia. The hanging of a horseshoe over your doorway, again, that's from Appalachia originally, to ward off evil. Never touch an empty rocking chair. They have some other weird ones.
It should be mentioned that magic was not as frowned upon as it is in other sort of Christian areas.
Yeah,
like it was an important part of the community.
Right.
Like there were officially appointed yarb doctors and
right. Dowsers.
Yeah, dowsers.
Yeah,
and women who were sort of appointed that role in society.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different, there's not much of it's almost like there's so much superstition that you need the counter superstition. You need to be able to counter it, so nobody's going to look at you like when you make the sign of the evil against the evil eye, or you knock wood, or actually that's probably not from Appalachia originally, but there was one I heard that was really weird. I didn't even put it down here. That if two women help another woman dress, the youngest one will die.
Okay.
Before the end of the year is supposedly an Appalachian superstition. There's just so many. You don't sweep under the bed of someone who's sick or they'll die. There's so many strange superstitions.
Yeah, and also some positive ones like the dummy suppers, or what was that called?
Oh, I'm not.
The dumb suppers.
Dumb supper. Oh, yeah,
that was it. Yeah, which is dealt with briefly in one of the stories, but that was a real thing where they would girls would sort of figure out who they would eventually marry.
Right.
Through a weird sort of laying out plates and stuff and.
Right. Yeah. That's what is it? You put out the plates and it's supposed to summon your future husband or whatever to the supper. Yeah. And I've heard ones about there's a lot of the equivalent of catching the bouquet at a wedding, sort of who's going to be next to be married. Supposedly, if you cut an apple peel long enough and throw it over your shoulder, that'll spell out the name of, or provide a visual clue of who your future husband's going to be. A bunch of things like that.
Yeah, so, it seems, from what I've read, most of the witchcraft was to do with love or that sort of topic.
Right. light a candle, look in a mirror, and you'll see your future. That's another one. Yep. Lots of little cantrips that that you would do, and they believed witches were everywhere, usually bad witches.
Yeah.
So and people who could give you the evil eye.
Wellman spent time in Appalachia, right?
Yeah, actually, it was he was in the Ozarks before World War II, and then after World War II, he moved to a nearby area and he started really studying the Appalachian folklore.
Yeah.
So it's actually. I can talk about.
Oh,
sorry,
okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, I've got a bit on Wellman actually.
I was just going to say the stories feel very authentic.
Oh yeah,
even stories where he's clearly making something up, it still feels like it would fit right into the local culture. Yeah. And the dialect is not annoying, which I was sort of dreading going in. Mm-hmm. You recommended this one. I hadn't actually heard of this before you mentioned it, but it started coming up elsewhere. There's a Hellboy story I recently read that was dedicated to Wellman. Anyway.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it can be. He's really nailed. He's a very good writer. He's got a very good command of prose, and he definitely he has the conversational methods that you would associate. I mean, again, without being able to check it myself, it certainly sounds authentic.
And all of the stories, save for one that we read, were actually written from John's point of view.
Right. Yes.
There was one story which was third person, and I'm not sure why, but
yeah. Well, it may have been that he didn't have a full handle on the character.
This was a later one.
Yeah, it's the Frogfather one.
No, it was. It was one of the later ones. We Don't Go There Anymore, I think it was called.
Okay. It
was about on the other side of the river. There was a place that you don't go, and a woman went there, and bad things happened.
Right. Yes, that was one of the shorter ones. Right? Yeah. He wrote a couple of little short ones, which
not one of the really short ones.
No. But he did write a couple of really short ones, and it's arguable whether they were officially Silver John stories because they don't even mention his name or anything.
Those reminded me of a Lord Dunsany collection called 51 Tales, but we'll get into Lord Dunsany another day.
That'll be down the line sometime, yeah. But well, Wellman is, since you brought him up, he's kind of an interesting guy. He was born, he has an origin that sounds 100% like a pulp hero himself, because he was born in Africa when his dad was stationed there as a medical military officer, if I recall correctly, Frederick Creighton Wellman. And supposedly his dad restored the site of a chieftain there, and the chieftain sort of was so grateful he adopted both Wellman's father and the boy, and so he was kind of whatever the local equivalent of a godfather is. And then eventually, when he moved back to the U.S., he's also supposed to have had...
you just said Africa, but it says here Portuguese West Africa.
Yeah, Portuguese...
Just to be specific.
Right, it was a place...
Africa's a big place.
Now Angola. It was Portuguese West... It was at the time known as Portuguese West Africa. And then when he moved... he's also supposed to have had Native American blood. Anyway, when he moved back to the U.S. and became a writer, his first book was called... Or his first story published was called The Lion Roared. It was published in Thrilling Tales in 1927. And it is, drawing on his African upbringing and all that stuff. So it's not surprising in many ways that he became a pulp writer from that. He did have a doctorate of laws, I believe. So he was college educated, and he sort of has a respect for college educated people, despite even Silver John himself is college educated, and at one point he's credited as having the equivalent of a PhD in folklore, even though he's never been to college and has never had any official book learning. That is, everyone talks about, and he has friends who are college professors who talk to him all the time. Yeah. So it's kind of hard not to imagine that Wellman was basing that on his own interviews with the local hill people, and he was sort of switching it around and making it, the protagonist being someone who was always being interviewed by college people. I did like in the first novel. The Old Gods Waken, he goes to see an old Indian man named Reuben Manco. Yeah. And he's and you go, oh my God. And then he's actually really smart about it. And Reuben Manco is a college professor who's an expert on world folklore. Yeah. He's Native American.
He starts out speaking stereotypically, but it turns out he's actually playing a joke on them.
Right. Yeah, he's doing it kind of to test them to see if they're going to be jerks about him, basically. Yeah.
And after that, he speaks very, perfect English, and and like you said, he's a professor of folklore, and
Yeah, he's got. There's two different characters in the Old God Waken who are college professors on the subject of folklore, and
they're both native,
the Native American stuff. But they know, and they're actually fighting European druids in that story.
Yeah.
There's an interesting actual subtext about how it's almost the Europeans trying to invade and with their folklore taking over from the Native American folklore,
but mixing into something new, which is interesting because it sort of mixes. Well, we're going into specifics in the story. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that's fine.
It mixes with the local Cherokee legends and local traditions, including the Raven Mockers, which are one of the creatures in the story, which are real Cherokee legend, though they're presented a bit more like Lovecraft monsters.
Right.
They're a kind of witch in Cherokee legend that sound like ravens, and they eat the hearts of the poor and weak.
Right.
Or the weak and feebled.
Right.
And they fly around, and like I said, they make the sound of a raven, hence the name Raven Mocker.
Right.
In this story, there's sort of a weird bird bat creature.
Yeah, they kind of get called to the site, but there are these two brothers who are druids, but they're kind of drawing on all the magic that's local, including sort of Native American magic, I guess. So at one point they have to fight off, sort of fight off and sort of avoid the Raven Mockers who get called there, and they're kind of the henchmen for the druids, actually. It's kind of they'll take what they can get in terms of but in that story they're kind of drawing on just whatever local powers and supernatural entities are to hand. Just one last thing about Wellman that I kind of thought was cool was he won a story. He wrote a story called A Star for a Warrior in 1946, which won the Ellery Queen Award which is I believe a mystery award. Mystery story, and he beat out William Faulkner, and apparently William Faulkner was really angry about that, and he was just really upset that like a mere pulp sci-fi fantasy writer had beaten him, and he literally wrote angry letters to the board and said, "Do you know who I am? I'm William Faulkner," basically. He got. But no, I mean, Wellman's a very good writer, so you can see why he did it. And he did write mystery stories as well. He actually he wrote some Sherlock Holmes pastiches, I believe.
Oh yeah, I haven't read it because it's out of print. But I saw he wrote a mashup of Sherlock Holmes meets War of the Worlds.
Right. Yes.
So it's what Sherlock Holmes was doing during the alien invasion.
Right. That was quite a bit later.
That was in the 70s.
Late 70s. But yeah, and then before that he had I think a supernatural detective that he wrote stories about, or maybe it was just detective.
He did. And apparently the second Silver John novel shares a villain with them.
Okay.
Pre-human inhabitants of America.
Right.
I can't remember what they're called offhand, but so apparently there was a Wade Wellman shared universe.
Oh, okay. There you go. As seems to have been the way with pulp writers a lot of the time. That in many ways that was the big 20th century pulp sci-fi thing. Lovecraft had it, Howard had it, and
though they were a lot looser than they are now, and I prefer that.
Yeah.
Prefer it looser, but anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's kind of like I've only got so many ideas, and I got to bang out so many stories at a given time. But yeah, no, they so. He was actually somewhat well regarded in his time. I get the impression that basically he wrote the stories sort of before the World War II, a decade or so after World War II. I think he sort of faded a bit into obscurity and then was kind of rediscovered later on. As we said, there was actually a movie made of Silver John known as either The Legend of Hillbilly John or Who Fears the Devil, which is on YouTube, interestingly enough. You can watch the whole movie on YouTube. It's actually kind of neat.
It's an interesting take on it. I read it described as in a review as a very smart movie, but not necessarily a cohesive movie.
yeah.
Because it has a lot of cool references in it,
Yeah.
It adapts the stories in an interesting way, but at the same time, it's sort of all over the place.
Right. Well, it's a series of vignettes, basically.
Yeah.
It's almost an anthology movie that just stars the same character.
And it's also sort of an origin of the character, which the books don't give.
Yeah, I actually really like the origin. Actually, that's a good segue, because John doesn't have an origin. He's just a guy who's been wandering the mountains.
And he has silver strings on his guitar, which can ward off certain spirits.
Yeah, and yes, because silver is a ward, of course, and as with many other cultures, it's a ward against evil. In the movie, what I think is actually kind of cool is the guy, the old man who raised him and may or may not have been his actual father. It's a little ambiguous.
Confusing.
But anyway, his adopted dad. He basically says, I'm going to string my guitar with silver and sing the Defy, which is the song you sing basically to, shut down the devil, basically. And so he melts down some silver dollars and sings the Defy, and then he gets killed, and it's because there wasn't enough silver in the real government silver dollars.
There wasn't any silver at the time, apparently.
Yeah, so it's because it was, the government messed him over. And the whole movie is actually very 60s, 70s.
It's very 70s, yes.
It makes him a hippie,
John
basically.
I was going to say, John is basically a hippie. Yeah. The music, other than the title theme, is more hippie music than Appalachian folk music, at least from what I understand.
Yeah, the hippie, the hippie folk music was kind of a thing. Yeah. So it is still folk music, but it's 60s folk music.
And the last shot of the movie is him marching on Washington.
Right. Yeah, that was kind of interesting. I know I've never seen them, but there's a series of movies around that time called The Legend of Billy Jack.
Yeah, I know.
Which has a whole thing about, a hippie.
He's half Native American, but clearly not.
Right. And I feel like they were kind of trying to tap into that with this adaptation.
Possibly.
That was kind of where they were going. John is much more of a sort of a, gosh, he seems younger in the movie than
he's definitely younger. That's why I felt it was more of an origin than a
Right. Which is
But it does straight up adapt two of the stories.
Right.
The Deserick of Yondro, which is was that how you pronounce it?
The Deserick on Yondro,
which is an interesting story that deals with sort of fearsome critters. Most of which it seems Wellman made up.
Yes,
but they
that's
seem
interesting.
authentic.
Yeah, well, that was actually something I was looking up because he goes up to a cabin with a greedy miser whose ancestor built the cabin, and the miser gets what's coming to him basically because there was a witch who's been waiting for him since his grandfather jilted her. But they talk about all the monsters that live up there, and they're all kind of the fantastical monsters, which seem like they would come authentically out of the folklore. Now, here's the interesting thing. For instance, they talk about the behinder, which is the thing that nobody's ever seen because it's always behind you, and if you turn around to look at it, it can hide really well. There is apparently something from folklore of that region called the hide behind.
Okay.
Tied into logger folklore. And it sounds like basically, from what I can tell, when loggers moved into the Appalachians, because it became a big logging concern late 19th century, and loggers like to make up fantastical creatures they'd say were living in the woods. So that kind of interwove with the Appalachian culture. So that's where all the sort of fantastical monsters. There are definitely some fantastical monsters in Appalachian folklore. There was one called the, let's see here, I'm going to check it out. The Yahoo, which is basically a Bigfoot, but an Appalachian Bigfoot. There's apparently something called the Snallygaster, which is a corruption of German, something Geist. I forget the exact word. But that is a giant bird with an alligator head, but still has a beak, which apparently eats the souls of people who are unwary or whatever.
As you do.
Well, but then another one of the stories talks about the ugly bird, a witch man who has a bird that is sort of he created maybe his soul.
Made out of his ectoplasm,
right?
Which
exactly.
They use that word, which is before Ghostbusters.
Yeah, that was a big thing in the 20s and 30s. They believed in ectoplasm as the spirit medium, basically.
Yeah.
So it was kind of, and it was almost pseudoscientific because Wellman sometimes tries to make it pseudoscientific because of the 50s and everyone liked pseudoscience at that point. But he, as scientific as a justification, even though it wasn't very good science, as opposed to fake science, making up stuff. Anyway, I think the first published Silver John's story is the ugly bird, and it's this guy who has a giant bird who does his bidding, and he's very unambitious supervillain because he just wanders around, sponging food off people.
Yeah,
and
telling people to give me food or give me a wife or
whatever he feels like. Yeah,
like he's basically omnipotent, but he doesn't bother going to the government.
He does. Well, he's a hill man. He probably doesn't think that far. He just doesn't think ahead of. In some ways, he's a reflection of Silver John himself, because John just goes wandering around the countryside, and he literally says, sometimes I was lucky to have 2 shirts, but most of the time I just had my guitar, and I just wander, and God will provide the rest, basically. So this guy's the same way, except the ugly bird provides for what he needs.
Yeah.
The ugly bird and his evil eye, I think he was implied he had kind of one eye that could curse you as well. But John ends up beating the ugly bird with his guitar, which has silver strings, and therefore destroys it. And does that kill Olmsted?
Yeah.
On what's his name? Olmstein.
Oh, I didn't write that down.
Mr. Mr. Onstelm. Onselm. That's it. Mr. Onselm. Yeah. I can't remember if it kills him or just
it does kill him.
Puts him out of commission.
Yeah, because when the ugly bird dies, it kills him as well.
Right. Exactly. But yeah, going back to the Desric on Yondro, there's a whole bunch of monsters in that story as well. And it does seem like Wellman made them up, because people say, oh yeah, I've heard about that in folklore, but whenever they trace it back, it's always to the Wellman story.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the skim, which hovers along the top of the trees and is like a basically living kite.
Sorry. Oh, yeah, go on.
Is that the skim or the flat? I'm getting those two mixed up.
The flat just lies on the ground and wraps around you like a blanket.
Right, okay. And the skim is like a sort of evil kite that swoops down on you, right?
There was one from one of the really short stories that he wrote called The Gardenelle,
right?
Which is he describes as a giant Venus flytrap, but it's made to capture men, so it's shaped like a cabin.
Yes, exactly.
And it digests you once you go inside of it.
Right, exactly. And again, he seems to have made that up. It doesn't seem to be a folklore thing. There was one touch in the Yandro story that I liked. One of the monsters is called the Culvin or Culverin, and it spits pebbles at you. But that's the name of an old-fashioned type of rifle, apparently.
Okay.
So it's almost like somebody heard about that kind of rifle, and they'd never seen a gun before, and they turned it into a monster that could spit pebbles at you.
Yeah, I was a bit disappointed that the movie didn't show any of these monsters. It did show the ugly bird. It was sort of a bad claymation, but what are you going to do?
They had no budget, clearly, for the movie. I can't blame them.
It just...
Yeah.
They did mention a lot of these monsters, so it was interesting. So it adapts that story and the ugly bird, and then does a sort of a weird thing with a plantation type story.
Yeah, that was a the movie's trying to capital S say something about America, basically. So
he goes into a cotton picking plant or cotton field, and it looks like a plantation basically.
Right.
And there's a fight between an evil voodoo man and a guy named Father Anansi, I think it was. Mm-hmm. So Anansi the spider, basically.
Right.
And
it's
John
like
helps him out, and
for that segment, they kind of imply that he traveled back in time to slavery. Because that was the implication, I thought.
Yeah.
They were trying to say,
yeah.
Like he somehow went, because everything goes sepia toned at that point. Like somehow he passed through a gate that threw him back in time, just for that segment of the movie, basically. Yeah. Which is essentially the climax, because that's the last story. Anyway, but as I say, it's a story
before
with
he goes to March on Washington.
Yes. It ends with him going to.
I'd like to see that story.
Exactly. Well, Billy Jack sequel apparently is him going to Washington and kicking butt and taking names or something. So that's the real sequel to Who Fears the Devil. But yeah, there's a really good song by Hoyt Axton. Again, it was made. I thought it would be a real old-timey folk song, but apparently it was written for the movie by Hoyt Axton. That's the song that you heard at the beginning there.
Okay.
But there's some great folk songs. And again, Wellman, he knew a few people, as we said, who were apparently tied into that. He knew a guy called Aubrey Ramsey, who was a folk singer, who was apparently quite legendary. I'm hoping I can play one of his songs later at the end of the show here. But yeah, just that great kind of bluegrass type of music, and a lot of it is where these legends come from, and it's tied into the folk legends and everything. So, but yeah, again, that was something Wellman knew, and he was tied into those guys.
Yeah, there's also mentions of a few grimoires in the story: The Long Lost Friend and what's called in the story is the Big Albert, which is apparently a real grimoire called the Albertus Magnus.
Right. Yes, the Albertus Magnus is. I have heard of that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but that's the big. They called it the Big Albert. That's right. Yeah. Again, it's the folksy version of. You can see it's kind of European folklore that got folksified more or less.
And there's like Wellman obviously knew what he's talking about with a lot of this stuff. There's a part in the novel, The Old Gods Waken, where they talk about the mythical history of England with Gog Magog and Brutus of Troy and all those.
Yes, yeah,
which is the origin of England, which is fairly obscure in North America. I mean, I hadn't heard it for most of my life.
Yeah, I've heard of that. The novel does seem a bit like Wellman's kind of like, look at this research I did, and showing off. He gets into that a little bit.
I'm fine with that.
No, it's great. It is really good. But he and Ruben Manco are constantly stopping to discuss the folklore that they know and how it might affect them, which is logical enough because some of it is about to attack them.
Yeah.
Gog Magog is supposedly a
giant
who. I'm not really sure the story, except that it was kind of a corruption of a biblical story that got turned into...
It might have been unrelated.
Yeah. Oh, really?
It might just be local Welsh, I believe.
Oh, yeah?
But yeah, he was a giant, and he was the leader of the enemy giants who at the time ruled England. Mm-hmm. Or what became England later.
Right.
So they were the sort of the original inhabitants of the land that Brutus came and conquered.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay.
This is all... like English,
right?
Brutus is tied into Roman history and tied into.
Well, this is a different Brutus. I think this is Brutus tied into the Troy.
Yeah. This is Brutus of Troy, not Brutus from.
Nah.
But he was a Roman. He was a Roman character.
Right. Yeah.
So Brutus was not Brutus from Julius Caesar.
No.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I didn't mean to confuse anybody there.
Well, but you are kind of right in that it's tied into Roman history because
he was a Roman. Brutus of Troy was a Roman.
Oh, okay.
But he was a descendant of Troy.
I see.
Of Aeneas of Troy.
Right.
From the Aeneid.
Because the Aeneid is funny because it's clearly the Romans going, oh, we want there to be an ancient storied history for us when we're founding our nation. So, yeah, we're the descendants of Troy. And it was also kind of like, because the Romans ended up fighting the Greeks, and it was kind of like, oh, yeah, we're the Trojans' revenge on the Greeks. And that they created this mythical history for themselves.
And then the English came along and said, we're connected to that.
Exactly. It's exactly the same thing where they give themselves a storied mythology that's tied into their genealogy.
But I read about Brutus and the Fairy Queen, which I thought it made up.
Right.
The Fairy Queen is an epic poem from the Elizabethan times.
Right.
And one chapter goes into the mythic history of England and goes through like King Lear and all these other people who probably didn't exist.
Right. King Arthur. Also.
Yeah, it goes up to King Arthur. He's a character in the story. Anyway, that's another book.
Yeah. No, but it gets touched on in The Old Gods Awaken, so it's relevant. But you can sort of see. You can sort of see. And again, Wellman is sort of doing it knowingly, and it's hard to separate from the real myth. But you can see how ideas kind of would get spread down and turn into the myths. Another one of the monsters in the Desert on Yandro is the Bammet. Which is
the mammoth,
which is apparently a mammoth, and also apparently a reference to the behemoth. So it got kind of morphed together into the Bamat. And also, I kind of like the implication that there's all these monsters sneaking around the shadows, and one of them is a mammoth.
Yeah,
and nobody notices there's a mammoth sneaking around in this cabin. But anyway, so that's a really cool story. There's the frog. Did you get to read Frogfather?
No, I couldn't find it. It's not online. I know I've heard of it. It's an early story that before he got his silver string, supposedly.
Right. Yeah. I would almost. It almost feels, again, it's one of those stories where you're not 100% sure it was actually technically a Silver John story, because I don't believe they refer to him as John, and he acts more as like the kid who's there to help the guy who's collecting frogs out in the swamp. Basically, it's Very Tales from the Crypt. This nasty guy goes out to collect frogs from the swamp, and they say, don't anger the frog father, and he goes, ha ha ha, I laugh at your frog father, and then of course the giant frog father shows up and eats him. Pretty straightforward, but it's kind of neat. But yeah, John is there sort of, and he's almost described as a kid, so it does feel like it's sort of a prequel to a lot of what happens.
Yeah, a lot of cool creatures in these stories.
Yeah.
One other who's like has one arm and one leg, and he's like he's from another dimension.
Yeah, It's very interesting how, if it was another writer, an older time period and actually even a modern time period, they just make it purely fantasy, I would think. But Wellman kind of almost tries to make, as I say, a pseudoscientific justification for a lot of it.
And this one's sort of tied into the multiverse idea.
Right, exactly.
Where there's different dimensions that are in soap bubbles.
Yeah.
It's a little confusing, but yeah, it was cool. Also, I really like the one where he gets his love interest.
Evadare, yes.
Evadare. That one had what was the monster in that one?
I forget what it's called, but it's the thing that lived in the cave and the guy came. I forget what it's called.
Yeah, but anyway, the point is,
I've got it on my tablet, but anyway,
the point is the monster turned out had converted to Christianity several years before and actually buried his friend.
Yeah.
And because there was a Christian burial.
Yeah, there's a wizard who has a magic fiddle who's kind of the fiddle can compel you to do anything he wants, and he's saying, I'm going to go out to this place where there's supposed to have been a monster, and a hero went out to fight the monster and never came back. And it turns out that when they go out there, the monster, the hero converted the monster to Christianity, and he's a good monster now. So the monster comes in and saves them from the wizard with the fiddle, which is kind of really a clever twist in some ways.
Yeah, that was actually the first one I read because because they were slightly out of order. I figured that wasn't the first one.
Yeah, and the one I read, The Ugly Bird, is the first story.
It was,
yeah. I think in the book that I read, they're in chronological order because Evadare is in that one, and then he does mention Evadare a few times later in the later stories, except Frogfather, which, like you say, is clearly a prequel. Yeah. But yeah, he gets a love interest named Evadare. She's
mentioned in the novel.
Wife. Yeah.
Yeah. They're about to be married in the novel.
Right.
And I think she gets mentioned in the other ones except for the last one, apparently.
Yeah.
Like I said, we haven't read the last four, but...
the few, he kind of... it's implied in the novel that he actually sort of decided not to marry her because he didn't want to give her the same wandering life that he had. He didn't have a house. He didn't have anywhere she'd just have to wander the mountains with him if she went with him, so he couldn't quite bear to propose to her for that reason. But there's something else about the stories I kind of like it just to mention here. I like the way that they're actually pretty upbeat, and there's a few times when a lot of the pulp stories often they can get a little misogynistic when a woman's involved, and if a woman's the bad guy, fair enough, there's male bad guys as well, but there's a couple of stories where there's a woman who's a bad guy and you're like, oh yeah, like in one other there's a woman who's gone up there to collect jewels that are supposedly in this place where one other emerges from, and she's being stupid, and it's obviously going to get them killed because one other's going to come out, and it's kind of like, oh, she's the one who's going to be an idiot and get killed. And then John actually saves her, and she apologizes and everything, and she's she redeems herself by the end. Mm-hmm. And that happens again in the story of The Little Black Train, where it's a woman who sort of built her empire, a railway empire, on sin, and she's celebrating that she got away with it, and the train is going to come and take her away. And again, John kind of sings a song, and she sees the error of her ways and goes, "Oh, you're right," and she gets out okay. So
I mentioned there was Lovecraft influence, but it seems very surface level. It's not Lovecraft's sort of misanthropy.
Yeah,
Lovecraft had a very he thought the world was basically...
Lovecraft, yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure Wellman read Lovecraft because he was a pulp writer. But I almost feel like he's more going... Like, Howard was influenced by Lovecraft, and I feel like Howard might have been more of an influence on his work than Lovecraft. But
fair enough.
Lovecraft via Howard, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I say, it's that sort of wandering hero type of story.
But it's very... a lot more upbeat than Lovecraft ever got.
Yeah.
And it has a very positive view on humanity and what we can accomplish. Mm-hmm. Even with all these monsters, we can sort of overcome them.
Yeah,
which is the opposite of Lovecraft, where we're just...
I dare I say it's a pre-World War II versus post-World War II attitude. Maybe. 50s and 60s kind of had a very, things were, people didn't like horror was kind of frowned at as well in the 50s and 60s to an extent, and there was always a sense of, oh, it has to be uplift. This is the era when, comic books had to be uplifting, and pulp, was seen as a certain, pulp was kind of dying for that reason, and, you couldn't do, and like as we say, people didn't seem to like mystical stories as much as something that was vaguely sci-fi. So there, you don't see a lot of big fantasy stories in the 50s, and that's where the story came from. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of the stories as well, just that gets fed into them. And I almost, again, if I'd been the one writing them, I would have gone full on mystical and magical, and I think a lot of other people would have. I like that
there's a mix.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, it's, like I say, for what they are, for the time and place, that just makes them very interesting. Anyway, I think we're going to put a pin on this for the evening. We'll saunter off into the sunset with our guitars on our back. No, okay, I'm not going to do it. All right. Fair enough. But we will say goodbye in yonder, and take care. And if you see a guy coming around with silver strings on his guitar, make sure to give him a good meal, because you never know when he might be there to help save you from a monster.
Oh yeah, just one last thing. Sorry, you gave. I do highly recommend this, and I would also recommend, if you like this, the comic book Rock Candy Mountain, which is more about rail hobo things, but it's set post World War II, but it's very good as well, and sort of it's more comedic, but it has a similar sort of folkloric feel to it.
Yeah, there's the hobo mythology. So there's kind of the logger mythology, there's the hillbilly mythology, and there's the hobo mythology. And they but it's all the Americana folklore type stuff.
Yeah.
So but that's a good story done by your friend of his, right?
No, I don't know.
You know? Oh, okay.
A lot of people I know him, but no, it's Kyle Starks.
Kyle Starks, yeah, he's a very talented guy. Yes, there's a few out there that are in keeping with that whole kind of thing. Anyway, that's it for the latest show. Want to thank our engineer-producer, Alex Ross, and Jack Feerick, who wrote the theme song. Also, credit to Hoyt Axton, who wrote the opening song. You can support us on Patreon if you like us, which I hope you do. And if you do that, you will be able to listen to the show a week early. We'll provide links to both myself and Phil's Patreon down below. Just a reminder that we also have an Instagram for the page, which we are putting up with interesting art, our own art, and actually we'd love to see your fan art as well. So if you have anything like that, feel free to post it to the Facebook page, which we also have. You can look up either on both Instagram and Facebook, we're What Mad Universe, so you can see what we've got there and join in the discussion on the Facebook page. Both Phil and I are on Twitter. I am at Prankster36, and he's at SpearHafoc, HAFOC_. So please follow us, and we'd love to hear from you. So to all you weary wanderers, from Phil and I and everyone here at What Mad Universe, hope you find a shelter for the night and a home-cooked meal, and y'all come back now, you hear?